Biblical stories as codes for deciphering the reality of the world today. Part 3. The Code of Sodom and Gomorrah. A small and rich elite, consisting of about 1% of the world's population, controls most of the Earth's economic resources, and therefore is able to propagate any agenda for the control and domination of world population, as well as the case with the COVID vaccine dictatorship. In the face of this horrific injustice, the camp of the awakened calls for social and political activism with the goal of amassing a critical number of people that would be able to regain control to the people. Activists all around the world have earned their PhD in the ways of the darkness by revealing and posting on social media each and every aspect of the draconian malicious scheme of the New World Order. The feelings of anger and fear that reading this information usually bring forth are then supposed to be harnessed to fight the darkness. However, the darkness is much more sophisticated and devious. Since it does not possess any power of its own, and therefore must feed on the energy of others, it makes sure to constantly incite negative thoughts and feelings of anger and fear. Thus the awakened, who rally and demonstrate against the darkness, unknowingly are actually playing into its hands, while the darkness succeeds in harnessing their action for its own benefit. In fact, those who dare to evaluate the situation objectively will have to admit that demonstration and rallies have not succeeded in changing the social and political reality. They only succeeded in making the participants tired and depressed. To what does this compare? This is similar to a battered wife whose psychopath husband drains all her energy, since he has no other way of existing but as an energy-sucking vampire. After years of blaming herself for his bad moods and failed attempts to pacify him, one day she finally decides to leave him and their home, longing and hoping to be free. However, she will not gain her freedom by physically moving out of their shared home, but by being able to emotionally disconnect from the past and truly start a new life. On the other hand, if this woman continues to feel that she is a victim, or continues to react to her ex's attempts to provoke her in order to suck her energy so that he can continue to exist, she will end up exhausted and miserable, even if she lives on her own. Therefore, we must understand and remember that those who can scare or upset us, in fact, control us and our consciousness. Additionally, we must understand and remember that anything that we resist will only intensify. The following story wonderfully illustrates this fact. A Western man went to an Eastern meditation master asking him to teach him to quiet his thoughts. The master, looking at the man in front of him, having realized that the request originated from the man's intellect and not his spirit, first wanted to teach him that one cannot control one's thoughts through the originator of thoughts, the intellect. He therefore asked the man to return the following day and until that time to avoid thinking about monkeys. What a strange request, the man thought to himself, since he never thought about monkeys. Nonetheless, he went back to his room, went to bed, and attempted to comply with the instruction to avoid thinking about monkeys. However, as you already know, everything we resist will only intensify, and therefore his mind was overflowing with all sorts of monkeys. The next morning, completely exhausted, he returned to the master and begged him for a single thing: please get the monkeys out of my head. Despite the thoughts that one should fight the darkness, the prophets, the harbingers of the light, presented an altogether different solution to the problem of evil in the world. The light does not wish to fight the darkness, but to shine. The light does not blame what is happening on the outside, but demands work on oneself. The light does not deal with feelings of fear and anger. Rather, it awakens the human spirit to trust and believe in the strength and grace of God. The light is not called for political activism, but for spiritual activism. If we examine the history of the people of Israel, we can see that the prophets always had only one solution to the suppression and control by empires with dark agendas: alignment according to the will of God. The prophet Jeremiah warned for years that the first temple would be destroyed unless the people of Israel purified their rotting, decaying morality and spirituality. The prophet Ezekiel added another reason for the destruction of the temple: idol worshipping within the temple itself. Despite it all, the kingdom of Judah, under the rule of kings Jehoiakim and Tzidkiah, chose to occupy itself with continuous uprising and rebellion against the Babylonian Empire. Consequently, in 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, destroyed the Great Temple. Therefore, it is absolutely right to say that the destruction of the first Great Temple was not because of the evil Nebuchadnezzar, but rather because of idol worshipping, illicit, ancestral sexual relations, and bloodshed. The Second Great Temple was destroyed in 70 CE from similar reasons. Due to the lack of true spiritual leadership for the people of Israel, who had been plagued internally by tumultuous political struggles, a small group of zealots succeeded in inciting a civil war, dragging the entire nation to revolt against the ruling Roman Empire. A rebellion whose vicious consequences from the very beginning were expected and known. Here as well, the destruction of the Second Great Temple was not because of the evil Titus, but because of the needless internal hate and warfare. Therefore, the entirety of the Bible, from the fall of Adam and Eve up to the destruction of the First Temple, are in fact one long story describing humanity's betrayal of God. That is the real reason for the pain and suffering, and not the power and might of the empires which serve the darkness. Only on a few occasions did the stubborn humanity choose to align itself with the will of God and trust His strength and grace, whereby an unexpected victory occurred. Pharaoh was defeated not because the Israelites demonstrated against him, but because the light answers the desperate cries for help of the enslaved Israelites and sent help to the leadership of Moses. Little David defeated the great Philistine giant Goliath because he held the most powerful weapon: his absolute unwavering faith and trust in the strength and might of God. The sinful city of Nineveh was spared because its king and people's willingness to immediately respond to the harsh prophecy of the prophet Jonah.
And the people of Nineveh believed God, and they proclaimed a fast, and put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them even to the least of them. But let them be covered with sackcloth, both man and beast, and let them cry mightily unto God. Yea, let them turn every one from his evil way, and from the violence that is in their hands. Book of Jonah 3.
As I mentioned, many people believe that because of a small group of evil elites who control the world, humanity is in danger of enslavement and doom. However, hardly anyone believes that a small group of light workers can accomplish the opposite. That is, to give humanity the chance for redemption and salvation. On top of it all, the logic of the intellect determines that only a critical mass of the awakened can bring about any chance of the change to this terrible global reality. However, the light's logic is the complete opposite. So much so that repeated reading or listening of the following will be necessary to grasp it at all. First, according to the light, the responsibility for humanity's sad state of affair does not lie with the wicked, but rather with the light's called or chosen ones, who fail to fulfill their mission, and in doing so, actually handed their power over to the darkness. As mentioned, the darkness does not have its own power, and therefore it feeds on the energy it sucks from others. Its preferred energy is that of people who were called or chosen by the light to fulfill the specific mission, and for that reason were also given additional power. The darkness lurks around these people, and using trickery and schemes is able to derail and knock them down, and in so doing, it takes their power for itself. In other words, humanity's main problem is not that it is controlled by the darkness, but that those who were supposed to lead it on the behalf of the light failed in their mission and left the world devoid of true spiritual leadership. Secondly, according to the logic of the light, it is not the quantity of the people who can change the fate of humanity and even save it altogether, but rather the quality of the people. This principle is demonstrated in the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is also a code. A small number of righteous ones can save mankind from destruction and ruin. For those who do not know or remember the story, here is a summary. Sodom and Gomorrah were two cities in the vicinity of the Dead Sea, which were destroyed by God due to the wicked and criminal behavior characteristic of its citizens. When Abraham found out about their impending doom, he could not accept it. So he proceeded to hold a long negotiation with God, asking for God to forgive and to avoid destroying them, arguing that the righteous one should not perish with the wicked. Abraham asked God if he would still destroy Sodom if 50 of the righteous lived there. God answered that he would not. Consequently, Abraham lowered the number to 45 and then to 40, and so forth until he got to 10, and then stopped. Since the minimal 10 of the righteous one were not found, both cities were destroyed.
The Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Genesis 19:4.
That is a story as we learned it at school, and it reflects the low level of consciousness. Remember the 2-year-old Daniel who avoided sticking his fingers in the electrical outlet because he was afraid that his mother would punish him? At a high level of consciousness, the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, which was very similar to that of Atlantis, can be explained by the laws of creation. First, a society which is characterized by material hedonism, which leads to sexual promiscuity, and thereby unavoidably to moral corruption that eats away the foundation of society, brings destruction and ruin upon itself by its own doing. Because we reap what we sow. It is simply the law of cause and effect. Secondly, what we call natural disaster is nothing but the work of the execution branch of the laws of creation, which is divided to the 4 elements: air, fire, water, and earth. In creation, there are elemental beings who are responsible for each of these elements and whose action can be demonstrated in all the biblical stories. For example, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the fire elemental beings are center stage, while in the story of the Great Flood, the water elements are at work. However, these elemental beings do not only destroy what does not correspond to the laws of creation, they are also responsible to help and assist human beings who align themselves with these laws. The best example for this is all the miraculous natural events that took place during the story of the Exodus from Egypt. In other words, what people call a natural wonder is also an expression of the action of the elemental beings. The cooperation between human beings and the elemental beings was an integral part of the plan of creation. It can only come about as long as human beings use their free will to do good. Man was given the ability to shape the gross material world through his will, which materializes not only through actions, but also through words and thoughts. Would you like a simple example of this, which does not even require any scientific studies for validation? For sure, at some point, every single one of you experienced how negative thoughts can weaken your immune system and cause the physical body to become ill. In ancient times, when humanity strove for noble goals, matter was less dense and heavy. The elemental beings were then able to lift and move huge rocks and help build beautiful, wondrous masterpieces, such as Machu Picchu and the pyramids in Egypt. We still need to explain and clarify how the existence of 10 righteous men in Sodom and Gomorrah could have prevented the destruction of these cities. How can we understand this code, which says that a relatively small number of righteous ones is needed for the world to continue to exist? A righteous person is a human being whose internal purity makes him an anchor for the divine power which flows through creation. That is because the light, in accordance with the law of the attraction between homogeneous species, will always seek to anchor in a man who, in his essence, is similar to the light. The righteous ones are not long-bearded religious leaders, nor spiritual teachers whose books are on the Amazon bestseller list. Most of them are unknown to the public, and even if we meet a righteous person, most likely we will not recognize him as an earthly anchor or channel to the power of the Creator. Only if we are somewhat more sensitive, the radiation that shines from the aura of this person can bestow upon us a unique experience of spiritual awakening and bliss that is rooted in the proximity to the light, an experience the intellect can never grasp. The power of each one of these righteous men, or by other name, the chosen one, can be equal to that of million regular people. Therefore, their action, words, and mostly their thoughts have a real effect on the density of matter, and consequently they work together with the elemental beings and are able to prevent catastrophes. Further, each one of them, based on his power, is connected to a large number of souls who are attracted to him due to the law of attraction. If a righteous one takes the position intended for him by the light, he in fact protects and guides all the souls that are connected to him, whether through active action, whereby they meet him, or through passive action, where his influence is veiled. One can equate the work of a righteous one to the aorta that transfers blood from the heart to the arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and vein. Each is significant in and of itself, but if an aorta bursts, the blood supply stops and death is imminent. In each generation, there is the righteous man of the generation, who leads the rest of the righteous ones, both actively and passively. All the righteous ones are, in fact, the spiritual leadership of the world, and that is why it is said that the fate of the world lies with them. The book of Revelation in the New Testament describes through different images the happenings of the days of the final judgment, which is the exact period we as humanity are at. According to this biblical prophecy, 144,000 human spirits are meant to work all together throughout the world in different positions, according to the instruction provided by the righteous man of the generation. It is an extremely small number in comparison to the entire world population. However, it is absolutely necessary in order to ascend and save those human spirits that can still be saved. Therefore, the first and most important goal of our school is to find the member of the spiritual leadership of humanity. Of them it is said, if you fail, the world will fall. If you believe that a very small group of people, comprising of only 1% of the world population, can steer humanity to the darkness, why can you not fathom that an even smaller group can lead the world to the light? If something in what you have read or heard now touches the depth of your souls, perhaps you are the ones called for the mission.